The Mishnah on Daf Lamed discusses the different grains that you're allowed to make matzah out of, as well as the different isurim that would prevent you from using those items to make your matzah out of. So the 5 grains that the Mishnah lists off that are proper to make matzah out of are wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. The Gemara brings a machlokes tanoim whether or not rice and millet can be used for matzah, and of course it would depend on whether or not they could become chametz. And there are those who learn that rice can become chametz, and therefore you would be allowed to make matzahs out of them, and there are those who hold that rice cannot become chametz, and therefore you're not allowed to make matzahs out of them. Then the Gemara discusses what is the halacha with matzah shira. If you kneaded dough with oil, wine, or honey, and you didn't mix in any water, would you be allowed to use those for matzah, and would you be over on chametz if they became chametz? So the Gemara says it's matzah shira, for sure you would not be able to use those for matzah. And Rabbi Barban says they don't become chametz because mei peris does not make chametz. And of course, that's only to be chayiv korish, but Tosfos says that it would be a lav, and if you mix some water into it, for sure it could become chametz. Then the Gemara discusses demai. The Gemara says you're allowed to make your matzah with demai, because demai is only midrabanan, and the Rabbanan said that someone who's poor is allowed to eat demai, and since anybody could be mafkid in a chosim and become poor, they'd be allowed to use demai for making matzahs. Then the Gemara discusses something interesting. The halacha is, normally the Kohen first takes his truma, and then the Levi takes his meiser. Well, what happened if the Levi came first and took his meiser before the Kohen had a chance to take his truma? So the Gemara makes a distinction. If the Levi did this while everything was still in stocks, then the Levi does not have to give the Kohen the Truma Gedolah that he lost out of. He just has to give the standard Trumas Meiser. And therefore, if the Levi did this and he gave the Trumas Meiser but not the Truma Gedolah, he would be allowed to use that wheat for matzah. But if the Levi did this at a more advanced stage of processing, where it was already a pile of grain, then the Levi does have to pay the Kohen back his Truma Gedolah, and if he didn't, then he would not be able to use that grain to make matzahs out of. Then the Gemara discusses Meiser Sheni and Hektish. When you're paid to them, if you're paid to your own Hektish or your own Meiser Sheni, you have to add 1/5 to the redemption. What if you didn't? So the halach is it's still considered redeemed, and therefore you would be able to use those for matzah. Of course, you still owe the money to Meiser Sheni, that extra 20%, and that extra 20% to Hektish, but it doesn't block the redemption, and therefore you'd be allowed to use those grains to make your matzah out of. Then the Gemara discusses a Kohen is allowed to use truma and challah, which are things that only a Kohen is allowed to eat. A Yisrael, a Zor, Meinaritos. Nevertheless, a Kohen is still allowed to make his matzah out of truma and challah, even though they're prohibited from Zorim for Zorim to eat them. Then the Gemara discusses tevel midrabanan. If something's only tevel midrabanan, for instance, it's grain that grew in a flower pot that had no holes, so it didn't nourish from the ground. There you need to give trumas and maishas, but it's only midrabanan. Nevertheless, such tevel you would not be able to make your matzah out of. And Rashi says because it's a mitzvah haba ba'avera. Then the Gemara discusses meiser and hektish that were not redeemed properly. Meiser could only be redeemed, Meiser Sheni could only be redeemed on a properly minted coin, not on just a blank piece of silver or other piece of metal. And if you did, it would not be considered redeemed, and therefore you wouldn't be able to use that grain for matzah. Same as if you were redeeming hektish with karka, you cannot redeem hektish with karka. You would not be able to use that grain to make your matzahs with. Then the Gemara gets into an interesting discussion. If you didn't completely discharge all your obligations of your trumas and maisers, you wouldn't be able to use that grain to make matzah out of. And the Gemara says, we learn it from the pasuk that says, Lo seichel olav chametz, the matzah that you make, Lo seichel olav chametz, and we learn that this grain that you use has to be able to have an iser chametz in order for you to be able to use it to make your matzah. But if it was tevel, it would not have an iser chametz. And the Gemara explains because we're going according to Reb Shimon, who holds ein iser chalal iser. Since this grain was tevel, there was never an opportunity for the iser of chametz to be chal on it, and therefore this grain would not be able to be used for your matzahs.